My name is Dr. Sarah Hirschhorn, and I'm the University Research Lecturer in Israel Studies at Oxford, and I am honored to be chairing the panel here tonight on the Trump presidency and its significance for the Middle East. Before I introduce our keynote speaker, who probably needs no introduction, Ambassador Dennis Ross, I just want to make a few cursory remarks to set the stage for our panel tonight. I'm not sure how many, if any of us, anticipated Trump's victory, but his presidency portends a perceivable shift in U.S. relations with the Middle East. Over the past 8 years, I need not underscore, have been tumultuous times in the region, and President Obama's foreign policy has been nothing but controversial. The Arab Spring swept across the sands of North Africa, spreading to Egypt, Levant, and the Gulf before chilling to a harsh Arab winter. More interestingly, perhaps, is where the firestorm of the Arab uprising did not spread to, including Palestine. The cycle of revolt and repression have reached their deadliest climax in Syria, and Obama's red lines are now crimson with the seemingly endless tide of bloodshed and displacement. Meanwhile, the threat of terror has not declined, though jihadis affiliated with ISIS actually heralded the president-elect's victory with, quoting, "What we want is that their country will be delivered to a donkey like Trump who will destroy it." Trump himself said little about the Middle East in the midst of the 2016 election campaign, other than his firm opposition to the Iran deal and hoping to roll back the JCPOA, pledging to knock out ISIS, and proposing to put Muslim Americans on a register. Although he has seemed to take quite an isolationist stance in opposition to nation building and regime change in his written platforms. Last but not least, of course, is Israel. Netanyahu and Obama famously got off on the wrong foot early on, and despite the Kerry Initiative in 2012, we are farther from a final status agreement than perhaps ever before. Israeli nationalism and settlement growth has proceeded unchecked. I like to quote that perhaps this is going to be making Greater Israel great again. And a third intifada is on the horizon, if not already underway. The stalemate between Israelis and Palestinians seems increasingly unsustainable. Trump himself has taken a hardline approach to Israel and has openly courted both the hardline Zionist and American Israeli vote, even going so far as to opening a campaign office in the West Bank. He has promised to roll back the Iran deal, move the Israeli embassy to Jerusalem, and support continued settlement growth, and has expressed his interest in doing the quote-unquote ultimate deal of Israeli-Palestinian peace by the end of his first term. With this sad summary of events, please join me in welcoming Ambassador Dennis Ross, who will surely bring decades of wisdom and experience to these questions. Ambassador Dennis Ross was the Special Middle East Coordinator for President Bill Clinton and also advised President George H.W. Bush. After leaving government, he co-founded the Washington Institute for Near East Policy with Martin Indyk and has been a key player in Israeli-Palestinian negotiations over the past years. This has included work to convince both parties to attend the Madrid Conference in 1991, to sign an interim agreement in 1995, and continued right on up to the Barack Obama's 2008 AIPAC speech, where he said Jerusalem should remain undivided. His latest book, Doomed to Succeed, documents the U.S.-Israel relationship from Truman to Obama and was published earlier this year.
Okay. Well, look, if one of the things I was asked to do was to explain what will President-elect Trump's policy be in the Middle East, and I'll start by saying I have no clue. So the idea that anybody at this point knows exactly what he will do as president of the Middle East, I think is, reflects a kind of hubris when what is called for is a kind of humility. What I'd rather do is set the context that he's going to face in the Middle East, because reality has a way of imposing itself. The truth is, as you said, Sarah, that there's a number of things that he said as a candidate. But for example, in the same speech at AIPAC, he said he was going to scrap the JCPOA, and then he also said he was going to enforce it. So we don't know exactly what he's going to do, and that's why it makes a lot more sense to try to, I think, understand what's the context he's going to face. And here I'd like to note, I find it interesting that having written a book, as you said, Doomed to Succeed, the U.S.-Israeli relationship from Truman to Obama, I find it interesting that every single American president from Truman to Obama face at least one major conflict or one major crisis in the Middle East. And yet, I think that when he becomes president, President Trump will face a dramatically more challenging Middle East than any of his predecessors, notwithstanding the fact that they all faced at least one major conflict. Now, why do I say that? Well, look what he's going to inherit. He's going to inherit a war in Syria that has produced 500,000 dead, 12 million refugees. Likely, he's going to inherit a situation where the eastern part of Aleppo will have been either depopulated or the Syrian regime will now be in control, but depending heavily upon Shia militias. Raqqa and ISIS will still be there, but in a sense is under assault. Syria, in effect, is two different kinds of conflicts. It's a civil war against Assad, and it's a war among the opposition groups against ISIS. And he's going to inherit that. And how he deals with that, we can discuss, but if that were the only thing that he was inheriting, it would be quite enough for one administration, given the character of it and what he's likely to have to deal with in terms of trying to answer it, and answer it in a way that doesn't ensure that he recreates the conditions or the conditions are recreated that produce the next incarnation of ISIS. But he doesn't face only Syria, he faces Iraq. And in his case, Mosul, shortly after he becomes president, is likely going to be rid of ISIS, or at least the visible parts of ISIS. And here again, what's going to happen in the aftermath of it? Is there going to be Sunni governance in the aftermath of it? Is there going to be Sunni inclusion in the aftermath of it? Or are we going to see what we saw in Fallujah and Ramadi, where the Shia militias basically engaged in looting, young Sunni males disappeared? In other words, recreating the circumstances that helped to produce ISIS in the first place? One of the challenges that the new Trump administration will face is, what do they do to help provide that kind of governance or reconstruction so that, in fact, they won't be facing the next incarnation of ISIS in Iraq? So there's Syria, there's Iraq. Together or individually, those would be huge challenges for an incoming administration. His administration gets to deal with both. Then there's the conflict in Yemen, which is a proxy conflict between the Saudis and the Iranians. The Iranians, as we're seeing, are sending weapons there. We're seeing some of the interdiction of some of the dhows that were carrying weapons there were clearly all coming from Iran. The Iranians have an interest in bleeding the Saudis there. The Saudis have an interest in not having the equivalent of Hezbollah on their border. I don't see that conflict going away anytime soon. We have Egypt, a country of 93 million. It has just gotten an IMF standby loan. Egypt has a shortage right now of rice, of sugar, of cooking oil. We cannot afford collectively for Egypt to become a failed state. If you think that the reality of the civil war in Syria created real challenges for Europe, may have contributed to Brexit here, certainly has created real strains within the European Union. Imagine what would happen if there isn't a response to Egypt in a way that stems the potential of it becoming a failed state. It might dwarf the consequences of what's happening in Syria and the implications it's had. But that's also something the next administration is going to confront. Shlomo, I heard you talking about two governments, a general, countless numbers of militias within Libya. Well, that's there as well. There is what Iran is doing in the region as a whole, where Iran uses Shia militias as a tool against Arab governments. It isn't only ISIS or Daesh that threatens the Arab state structure. It's also the action of Iran and the use of Shia militias. It's one thing to say that you're going to deal with Iran and the nuclear deal. The fact is, as I said, in the AIPAC speech, candidate Trump said two things that actually are contradictory. That he would scrap the deal, he'd also enforce the deal. Well, how he chooses to deal with Syria has implications for how he deals with the larger question of the challenges that Iran poses through the use of Shia militias. And all of that is taking place against a backdrop of what you were talking about, a threat to the state structure within the region. And yes, that is a struggle over identity, but it's also, I think, a reflection of different layers of conflicts that we see within the region. Now, that's a backdrop that looks pretty daunting, to say the least. Against that backdrop, I would identify two interesting potential assets for the new administration. One asset is that there is this interesting convergence of strategic interest between Israel and most of the Sunni Arab states. And while that interesting convergence of strategic interests has not revealed itself in dramatic, public, tangible forms of cooperation, what we do see, or at least what we're aware of, is that there is very practical forms of cooperation that is below the radar screen. That did not happen because of the Obama administration. In many respects, it happened in spite of it, because that convergence of strategic interest was also a reflection of a convergence of concerns about the Obama administration's approach to the region. But that is an asset. This convergence of interest, this practical, tangible form of cooperation that is quite real, even if it's not particularly visible, it can be very useful in dealing with how you contend with Iran or how you contend with radical Sunni Islamists. It might also be useful in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian issue. I won't belabor that right now. We could probably get into it. I think it's very difficult to see that the traditional model of a strictly bilateral negotiation between Israelis and Palestinians is going to produce anything. At this point, the Palestinians are too weak, too divided, to even look at negotiations as anything but a concession, which they're not prepared to make. Not to mention that if they were at the table, they couldn't make any concessions. But maybe with Arab cover, something becomes possible. But the same is true for Israel. Because Israelis look at the Palestinians, they feel that any concession they make is going to produce nothing from the Palestinians. So if they want to gain something, it won't be from the Palestinians, it would be from the Arabs. Well, maybe that strategic convergence, that practical cooperation, is useful not only in terms of dealing with the larger threats of the region of Iran or the radical jihadi Sunni threats, but maybe it can also be useful in the Israeli-Palestinian context. So that's one asset. And the second asset, there is a very interesting transformation taking place in Saudi Arabia. It's not just that they have a national transformation plan. I was there at the end of August. I saw literally the entire Saudi leadership. One of the Saudi leaders said to me, "Welcome to our revolution disguised as economic reform." I could go through the litany of things that are taking place there that promise the potential for a real transformation. And not just economically, but politically, even socially. Obviously, it's not going to be a linear progression. Obviously, there are also real sources of resistance to it. But the fact is, we have a real stake in that success. And the reason we have a real stake in that success is pretty simple. Again, picking up on the last panel, I would state something maybe a little bit differently, but I'd say it in the following fashion, and then I'll wrap up with this. There has never been a successful model of development or modernization in the Arab world. There have been a constant stream of pretenders since Nasser's time, secular and Islamists, who claim they will restore greatness that has been lost, that they have the answer. What is the Muslim Brotherhood's slogan? Islam is the answer. Islam is the solution. None of them have had the answer or the solution because, in fact, they don't have any practical approach to dealing with how you reconcile modernity with Islam. But here, we now see in Saudi Arabia a genuine effort to do that. And if they succeed, the implications of that are not just going to be felt in Saudi Arabia. Having a successful model for the first time is something that could be transportable. Well, that again is hugely in our interests, and the new administration, if it recognizes it, should realize against this daunting set of challenges, these potential assets that I've identified, maybe not so potential, those assets that are there are assets that can be translated if there's a recognition of both the nature of the problems and a recognition of how these assets could in fact be taken advantage of to contend with the wide array of problems. Now, whether or not the new administration is going to be up to that, that remains to be seen.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Ross. We're going to move into a panel discussion, and since the bios are in the book, I'm just going to give you a brief synopsis of the credentials of our esteemed panel. To my left is Brigadier General Michael Herzog, who is a senior visiting fellow at BICOM and an international fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, recently retired from active duty. And farther down is Professor Jonathan Reinhold, the deputy head of the politics department at Bar-Ilan University and an expert on U.S.-Israeli relations and the recent author of the book, The Arab-Israeli Conflict in American Political Culture. And last but not least, Ehud Yaari, who is also an international fellow at the Washington Institute, as well as an award-winning commentator with Israel's Channel 2 and well-known in the Israeli media scene. So I have a few questions I'd like to take the privilege of the chair to ask, and then we will open the floor to questions. And the first, to borrow Professor Avineri's line, is that the Middle East, and specifically the Levant, is like Humpty Dumpty and unlikely to be able to be put back together again in the same pieces and configuration in which it currently sits. As a result of the Arab Spring, multiple catastrophic refugee crises, and the dissolution of Syria and Iraq, there's likely to be a redrawing of the map of the Middle East. What can and should President Trump encourage in this map-making exercise? Should a state of Kurdistan come into existence, what would this mean for the future of a state of Palestine and the general redrawing of these borders?
I spoke. Why do you let Mike start with that one?
Okay.
Okay, as Dennis said, we have to be humble here because I think Trump is very unpredictable. We don't know exactly what he's going to do in the Middle East. I don't think he knows what he's going to do. But he's going to discover several things when he starts studying the Middle East, because I don't think he knows much about the Middle East. He recently said that he would like his son-in-law to do the impossible deal between Israelis and Palestinians, that he is very knowledgeable of the region. And some friends of mine who met Jared Kushner say he knows little about the Middle East. So he has to learn a lot. When he learns a lot, he will discover, number one, that this region is highly complex and it's been in turmoil for 6 years now. It's not that easy to fix unless you're willing to be very assertive, apply military force as the Russians have done, find effective partners in the Middle East and work with them. And the track record of the Obama administration hasn't been that great on all of these issues, and the perception in the Middle East of the Obama administration is rather negative, as we all know. So that's complex, and I think Trump will have to decide how high a priority the Middle East is on his agenda. There are many international issues to deal with, and in the Middle East itself, you have to prioritize, and I think perhaps one of his first priorities will have to be Syria, because there's a war going on with millions of refugees and strategic consequences and so on. And I think that Trump will have to maneuver in the tension, conflicting consideration. On the one hand, this instinct that he expressed during the campaign to adopt a more isolationist stance for the United States. On the other hand, if you want the US to be great again, you have to be more assertive internationally. So he will have to find his way in between these two poles. You will also find that there are tensions within expressed policies. For example, as we said, we don't know much what his policies will be, but he and some people around him did express certain views about the Middle East. Number one, anti-Islamist views, both he and people around him. Definitely anti-jihadist, but I assume also anti-political Islam, like Muslim Brotherhood parties and so on. He said that he would like to develop common ground with Russia in the Middle East. He said that definitely he'll be a friend of Israel, and I assume that this administration will be friendly to Israel. And he said that he will undo the deal with Iran, or at least enforce it much more than the Obama administration has done. And it seems that his administration will care less about human rights than the Obama administration. So taken together, I think Trump is going to discover that there are going to be a lot of tensions within these policy lines. I'll give you several examples. If you want to develop common ground with Russia, you have to give them certain things. Elsewhere, will he do it, will not do it? If you want to be assertive with Iran and enforce the deal, and I assume not only the deal itself, but be more assertive vis-à-vis Iranian destabilizing policies in the Middle East, you may find yourselves opposing Russia, or the Russians opposing you, and you, at the same time that you want to develop common ground with the Russians. He will find that some of the US allies are fighting between themselves. Both Turkey and the Kurds are essential for defeating ISIS, yet they are sworn enemies. Which leads me to your question about Kurdish independence. I don't see great chances for a Kurdish state emerging, because all states involved in this are against statehood, namely Iraq, Iran, and Turkey. But there are prospects for an autonomous Kurdish region emerging in Syria. It already exists. The Turks would like to wipe it out. But maybe one of the outcomes of a US-Russia deal would be some kind of a decentralized system in Syria, where there is a Kurdish autonomy. The only, I think, realistic policy outcome for the Turks to hope for is that it will not be contiguous along their borders. And so I think when Trump looks deeper in the Middle East, you will find that it's much more complex than meets the eye or his words.
I'd like to, if you don't mind, take the question to a different place and say, instead of looking out at what's going on in the region, to look at Trump's strategic instincts. So it's clear he doesn't have policies, right? There's plenty of contradictions. There's no cohesion, he doesn't understand the details. But there was one thing in the campaign that he was very, very clear about and consistent, and Mike mentioned it, and that is this mixture strategically of being assertive, willing to use military force, unilateralist about that. We're not interested in allies, we don't care, we question NATO, right? We say, you know, what about, is our commitment real? We don't mind the Russians, giving the Russians a free hand in Ukraine. We don't mind giving the Russians a free hand in Syria, okay? But we'll crush ISIS and we'll crush Iran if it goes nuclear. So you have a mixture of isolationism, protectionism economically, and assertiveness. And this has been not seen at the heart of American grand strategy since 1941, since Pearl Harbor. In the 1930s, there was such a thing, both among Republicans and Democrats. And the academic Walter Russell Mead, who edits a journal or a magazine called The American Interest, calls this Jacksonianism, after Andrew Jackson, 19th century American president. And so for me, the question is, A, what does this mean for the Middle East if these instincts do translate into something that informs policy? And if they don't, what would be the alternative for a Republican administration? Well, some of the things we've already heard, that if we take Syria, for example, there's a contradiction in allowing the Russians to do what they want and being assertive vis-a-vis Iran. Because if you allow the Russians to do what they want, you allow them to have an umbrella over the Iranians, who are the strongest external force on the ground in those areas under the control of Assad. So what you are basically doing is allowing Iranian power to grow, and if there comes such a time as you wish to be assertive, the price that you, Israel, or the United States will pay will be much higher. If you intend to break the agreement and say impose unilateral sanctions. Unilateral sanctions are meaningless vis-a-vis Iran. So if you're not prepared to use force in short order, then you don't have a coherent policy on those issues. So on Israel and the Palestinians, if you say, as the ideological right in Israel understand Trump, well, he's just going to leave it. He's just going to let them do what they want, right? One of the consequences of that, given the lack of stability in the Palestinian Authority, given the fact that Abbas is 81, given the fact that there will be a struggle over the leadership in the foreseeable future, could well be that the currency in such a leadership struggle could become how many Israelis can you kill? Israeli-Palestinian Security Cooperation would collapse. And for me, it's very interesting that the Israeli center-right, the non-ideological right, is not so sure that it's keen on Trump. Netanyahu signs a $38 billion aid deal with Obama, a deal which is on worse terms than previous deals. Avigdor Lieberman, no liberal he, right, says maybe we should have a settlement freeze outside the settlement blocks. And if you think about it, right, that means that for Israel, even the center-right Israel, okay, an America that takes a step backwards strategically creates a vacuum. And that vacuum is filled either by greater instability, forces less friendly to Israel and America's Arab allies in the region, or forces which are downright hostile to them. So this creates quite a dangerous dynamic, okay? And I'm not going to go into it, but it would create an even more dangerous dynamic in the Baltic states, which are NATO allies. What's the alternative to this? The alternative, I would say, is not Andrew Jackson, but Henry Kissinger. Why Henry Kissinger? Because Henry Kissinger's a Republican who has to deal with the fact that the United States is not going to be directly engaged globally by putting American ground forces all over the world. He's a post-Vietnam, no more 500,000 troops in Asia. What does he do to resolve this? He does not go isolationist. What he does is he puts more emphasis on American allies. You continue to be internationalist. You continue to be selective engagement. You continue engagement in a selective way. You continue to be assertive where your vital interests are at stake, but not everywhere and in every situation. And if you want to understand where the US-Israel strategic relationship really takes off in terms of military aid, in terms of security coordination, it's between 1970 and 1975. And that is the same period in which the US is withdrawing its forces globally. At the same time, it's simultaneously supplying more arms, and giving political and strategic support to its allies, at that time, the Shah of Iran and Israel. And I think that the crisis of confidence in the United States in the era of Obama, throughout the world, all American allies were asking themselves, how reliable is the United States? It's certainly more intense in the Middle East with Israel, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia. And the one thing that a Trump administration could do would be to look at the Kissinger model and say, well, if I want to be assertive and I want to be internationalist but not invading every second country, then this is a model that I need to adopt, and that means working through and reassuring your allies.
Thank you. So I think that when Trump and his team take a look at potential allies in the Middle East, Israel aside, a different story, then they don't see much. They do not see today any reliable, dependable, stable Sunni ally in the region that you can form a real partnership with. Then is mentioned, and rightly so, Egypt. Can you imagine the implosion that can take place there? As a senior Egyptian official told me, 90 million people living along a Suez Canal. He has Algeria, which is probably next, when Mr. Bouteflika finally leaves the scene. Saudi Arabia, how stable is the country now controlled by a 31-year-old prince, waging war in Yemen? I'm not sure. Well, it's very impressive, as Danny said. They are trying to go for real reforms, if not a revolution. But Saudi Arabia runs the risk of fragmentation in the longer run. Turkey, Erdogan is a dependable, reliable ally. I'm not so sure. And my conclusion is that probably, that is as if I'm saying I have a clue how Trump will act in the Middle East. I think that he will try to minimize the damage, to contain the mess in the Middle East. This is what it is, rather than fix it. And this will be the overall approach, which will leave quite a maneuvering room for the Middle Eastern players. I'll give you an example. I think that the most important trend emerging in the region now, not yet in the headlines of The Guardian, is the emerging competition between Turkey and Iran. It's happening, and it can easily happen underground by proxies. How does the new administration tackle this? I don't know how far Erdogan is willing to go in order to prevent contiguity of the Kurdish enclave in the northern Syria, Rojava. I'm not sure how he views Mosul. But please remember, Erdogan said that the 1923 Lausanne Agreement is not in place. And if you read Turkish newspapers, you will see the map. Aleppo is part of Turkey. I'm not saying it's the policy, but I'm saying it's a direction. Aleppo on the maps is part of Syria, is part of Turkey. Mosul is part of Turkey. That could be a challenge. And with your permission, I would like to go closer to our place, Israel.
I think I was gonna save that for our next question. Maybe I'll have to give Dennis Ross to comment if you had anything to say about this.
Look, I think one thing that no one has mentioned, we're looking for clues as to what a President Trump will actually do. The clues could be provided by who he appoints. And we haven't seen his Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense yet. Ehud, his national security advisor, has written in the book that he did that he views Israel, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia as being the core American allies who we should do much more with, because he sees them as the key to confronting the radical Islamic threat that he defines. By the way, when he defines a radical Islamic threat, it's Sunni and Iranian together. He doesn't draw a distinction there. So is that an indication? I don't know. We'll see. That's why I say I think we have to wait and see. And this, Jonathan, this gets at your notion that it's the Kissinger alternative. It depends. Who's the Secretary of State going to be? Who's Secretary of Defense going to be? And how does he define his role as president? Is he chairman of the board, in which he delegates a lot? We already know that right now the vice president's the one who's getting the daily briefings, national security briefings. He's not. Is that an indication of how this administration is actually going to work? And if that's the case, then those appointments become even more important. And that will be more of an indication of what we will do. His instinct not to be a nation builder, I think, is very clear. But I think collectively, one thing we have probably learned, the United States has learned, is that we're not real good at nation building. And so therefore, that really shouldn't be a preoccupation. But not being good at nation building doesn't mean that you stay out of the Middle East, because you realize vacuums that emerge in the Middle East will be filled by the worst possible forces, and those will end up being a threat to us. So I think, again, humility should still be the order of the day in terms of how much we're prepared to predict about what the Trump administration will actually do.
Well, that probably brings us to our next question, the ultimate act of hubris, that Trump has said that he wants to conclude the ultimate deal in the Middle East, and perhaps, as we've heard, that he intends to appoint his son-in-law, Jared Kushner, a renowned expert on Israeli Arab affairs, to lead this charge. We do know from the platform of the Republican Party and from some of his written statements during the campaign, mostly crafted by his advisors, David Friedman and Jason Greenblatt, who apparently will be part of his Israel transition team, from what we know at the moment, that they've written quite strongly that that they don't really see a two-state solution. This is the GOP platform really explicitly denies the Israeli occupation. I'm wondering what the panel thinks about and the prospects for a two-state solution, and should or could the Trump presidency encourage Israel to annex Area C, a topic of debate that has moved from the fringes of the Israeli political spectrum into the mainstream over the past few years? Perhaps we'll start here with you. And could I ask, I'm sorry, that the panel just keep their answers brief, because we want to give some opportunity for the audience.
Well, look, how does one square his desire? What he said, it's not just that he said this is the ultimate deal. What he said is that he would love to be the one, I'm quoting him, he would love to be the one to be able to produce peace between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and I'm adding his quote, and he has reason to believe that he can be the one to do it. Now, how does that square with annexing Area C? How does that square with ruling out a two-state outcome? I think if you're thinking in terms of a deal, some of the positions that might have been in the Republican platform may not seem to be consistent with what seems to be his aspiration, which again, I'll say, this actually puts him in the mainstream of American presidents. I mean, having written a book about this, what I can say is almost every American president, and if we had time, I'd go through chapter and verse, almost every American president saw themselves as being a peacemaker on this issue for a variety of different reasons. Well, this is not what separates Trump from his predecessors. This is what makes him more like his predecessors.
First, I believe that when the Trump administration gives a hard look at the Middle East and prioritizes issues, the Israeli-Palestinian issue would probably not be at the top of the list. There are more pressing issues like Syria, like Iran and others, and strategically, I don't think that this will pop up as a major issue that they have to invest political capital in. If Trump tries to do that, I think it may be only out of a psychological desire to show that he can do the impossible. He's a deal maker, but that's not a strategic reason to prioritize this deal. Secondly, talking about a bilateral Israeli-Palestinian agreement runs against the current in the Middle East today. I mean, following the collapse of the 2014 peace negotiations, nobody believes that you can get the parties to the table and produce anything. Israelis don't believe in it, Palestinians don't believe in it, Arabs don't believe in it. So you are out there running against the current and saying, no, I'll force a deal on the parties. I just don't believe, very hard for me to see. I think that one thing that's possible, since there is an opportunity with the Arabs, since Israel has exceptional dialogue today with major Arab states like Egypt, Syria, and others in Gulf states, if a regional framework for peacemaking presents itself, which has been a subject of talk between the parties for many months now, though it's very difficult and the window will not be open forever, But if that happens, I think he will support it. And I think probably there is a chance that the Israeli government will try and get him on board such a regional approach. Unlike the Obama administration,
But Mike,
which...
can I just say, but you're not going to have a regional approach that works if you try to annex Area C.
No, I agree with that. I agree with that. Again, it's as the Arab saying goes, there's no customs on words. You can say anything during campaign. When you have to make policy decisions, it's more difficult. I agree, but I think there is a chance, along the lines of what Lieberman said, that we'll adopt some kind of a regional approach, and he can kind of support it. That should be possible. Generally speaking, I believe that he will consult with the Israeli government. I don't think he's just going to impose out of the blue anything on the Israeli government. And that pertains also to other regional issues we discussed. Talking about allies in the Middle East, which Ehud mentions, and I generally agree with him. When they consult the Israeli government is going to tell them, you have to invest in Egypt. You have to invest in Egypt. It's a critical ally. And in my view, if I had to predict, they will listen.
First of all, Dennis, your point's well taken about the chairman of the board, and we don't know. What I would like to see is what can we practically do to avoid the situation getting worse and to perhaps help it get it better, given that it's very unlikely that we can resolve it in bilateral negotiations in the near future. I'd like to avoid neglect on the one hand and sort of a messianic, typical presidential belief that they can do what nobody else can do. And I think there are a couple of things, one of which is the settlement freeze outside the blocks idea. And this has not been popular with the Obama administration, which in principle believes that this is a final status issue and you shouldn't make distinctions between this and that settlement. And I'm sure that's absolutely right in principle and will just contribute to the situation getting worse in practice. I think it's very interesting that of all Israeli politicians, Victor Lieberman has picked this up. And here the advantage of having a president who doesn't seem to have very set views, who doesn't really care what the standard operating procedures of international diplomacy are, could perhaps be an opportunity. Maybe he'll just say, yeah, it sounds like a good idea, you know. So I think there might be an opportunity to do something there. And this is where Area C comes in. I think that this is a critical thing for partition. If you believe that partition is a vital interest of the state of Israel, then changing the status of Area C is a critical moment. And there are two things you could do. You could make Area C, which is under full Israeli civilian control, you could annex it and kill partition, kill two-state solution. Or you could say, we're going to change civilian control from Israeli to Palestinian. This doesn't involve touching settlers, it doesn't involve security, but it signals a direction in terms of Israel's credible commitment to two states or partition in some form or another. So I would like to see on our side, on Israel's side, those things. And what I'd like to see on the Palestinian side is something that Trump is much less likely to do, which is to try and see if there's another Salim Fayyad, try and see if there's another Palestinian who can actually, on the ground, improve the situation. I don't know whether that's possible, because that's more El Jari's territory than mine, but that's what I would like at least a search.
Just back to a second, I think Dennis just wanted to come back in on a point here.
Just on, Jonathan, on your point on the Obama administration and the non-differentiation of settlements, you're exactly right. But it's also a contradiction within the administration itself. The president made two speeches in May of 2011 where he talked about 1967 and mutually agreed swaps. By the way, in Jimmy Carter's article in the New York Times, he selectively quoted that line. He said only 67 and dropped the mutually agreed swaps. But the reason that's significant, and it fits with what Lieberman's saying, is when you say 67 and mutually agreed swaps, by definition, you're creating a distinction between settlements. Because mutually agreed swaps refers to settlement blocks. You don't have swaps unless you're talking about settlement blocks. And going back to Camp David, we were talking about 1967 and mutually agreed swaps. So settlement blocks where you might accommodate 80% of the settlers, and then you swap some kind of compensation. So this notion that you talk about 67 and mutually agreed swaps, but then you don't draw a distinction between any settlement beyond the June 467 lines, is an inherent contradiction.
There is no grand deal to be made. Unfortunately, the Palestinians have taken their decision many years ago. I've been saying it since day one, Oslo. They have taken a decision that a statelet, what they call in Arabic Duwaila, a statelet over the 67 borders, with its capital is Jerusalem. This is not what the Palestinian national movement is about. And for this, you do not pay the price by way of the necessary concessions and compromise over refugees, Jerusalem, etc. I'll just give you a quote. Dennis has heard it from me before. Somebody who lives in London. And the rumor says lately he was dating a Jewish lady. And he was the close advisor and counselor of both Chairman Arafat and Mr. Abbas. His name is Ahmed Khaledi. Ahmed Khaledi said, here is the quote. He's happy when I'm quoting him. He said, and it's in writing too. He says, the whole concept of a Palestinian state is nothing but a punitive construct devised by the worst enemies of the Palestinian people, the US and Israel, in order to constrain Palestinian territorial aspirations and their moral claims. End of quote. Now, if the grand deal is impossible, and I've spent all my life in the no man's land between Israelis and Palestinians, and I'm not a spring chicken anymore. I don't know any Palestinian who sees this statelet as the objective of the Palestinian movement. But if it's so, and we have the regional option, but in a slightly different way, nothing will move, I believe, except further fragmentation of the Palestinian Authority. Do they enter refugee camps in the West Bank? Those seven battalions? Not really. Can they win a confrontation with the armed Tanzim of Fatah, the cadres of Fatah? They are well armed. Once Mr. Abbas is gone, I am not sure. I mean, people were speaking here about the security cooperation between the Israelis and the Palestinian security organizations. True. They are responsible for about 25% of arrests, but they don't keep them and they don't follow through with investigation. But do you know that most of the Palestinian security personnel are on half-time basis? And on the side he runs a grocery shop? Etc. We have to get real. What I mean to say is, the only way to get things moving and prevent the slippery slope towards a one state, which is an imperative, is for Israel to take the initiative and whisper on the ear of the next president. We are willing to go for a very generous, comprehensive interim, whatever you want to call it. Abbas doesn't like the word interim. 80% of the West Bank, gradual implementation. And we want nothing, no recognition, only security arrangements and freedom of action for the IDF and the Shin Bet. Now, you know as well as I know that Mr. Abbas doesn't like the word interim, and he doesn't want anything provisional. But would he have a choice if this was an offer coming from Israel to the American president, to the UK, EU, Japanese, other donor states? They would come to Abbas and tell him, let's go. And the regional aspect, I'll finish with that, is that you can tie it up. Mr. Sisi will not initiate a peace treaty between Israel and the Palestinians. He doesn't have the gravitas in his own country to do that. But if we make gradual progress with the Palestinians, then we can tie it up with gradual progress with the Arabs according to the Arab Peace Initiative. That is, the Arab Peace Initiative promised Israel normalization and recognition in case you have the end of conflict, end of claims, deal with the Palestinians. What about gradual normalization simultaneously with progress on the Palestinian front? I do believe this is the only option, but I don't think the initiative will be taken by a Trump administration until or unless it's coming from Israel, and I don't think it's going to come from Israel with the present configuration of the coalition.
Can I ask one last question before I open it up to the floor? Using your terms, the slippery slope, I think the assumption is that without the United States playing sheriff in the Middle East, that the slide towards chaos will only accelerate. I'm going to assume from my panel that the answer is no ahead of time, but is there any beacon of hope of having America and the Trump presidency take a more isolationist stance and perhaps yields to European powers, if not Russia, Iran, and other nations that would like to play a more active role and create their own spheres of influence in the region, and letting them take a more activist role than we've seen in the past in the Middle East and perhaps in Israel-Palestine in particular?
Well, look, let me answer your question in two ways. First, with regard to letting others take a more activist role in the Israeli-Palestinian issue, look at the first term of the George W. Bush administration. They completely walked away from any peacemaking. They left it wide open for anybody else to come in and act. Did they? It's a rhetorical question. Tell me who's going to play that role. Tell me who has the ability to play that role. I mean, again, it's a rhetorical question. So I don't see anybody else being able to play that role. It's not that the U.S. has, at different points, has actively prevented others from playing that role. I can tell you when I was a negotiator, I used to get complaints from some of the people here in Europe that I was preventing them. I said, I don't prevent you. It's the parties that prevent you. It's not me. You know, if I want you in and they don't want you in, you're not in. If I want you out and they want you in, you're in. So it's not a question of whether or not, you know, others can go play the role. You know, the French have been trying in this past year to do something. Look promising to you? So I don't, you know, I'm simply stating an observation here. Now on the first part of your question, again, I'm repeating myself, but it depends on who comes in and how they define what is a threat to us. Jonathan was quite right. If you look at the historical antecedents of Trump's language, maybe not his behavior, because we don't know what his behavior is going to be yet, go back to Senator Bora. Yeah. And the terminology from historians has been belligerent isolationism, meaning we will be active in the world, but we'll be active in the world on our terms. We'll be unencumbered. And we don't know if that's what this administration is going to be or not. We just don't know. It depends on how they define threats. It depends on whether or not they think that we have to act. I do think there's going to be an impulse not to want to carry the entire burden. That's one of the other things. When Trump was critical of raising questions about NATO, he was raising questions about, well, what are the commitments that are being made? He did the same thing with regard to Japan and Korea. Now, the reality, when you're president, suddenly you look at, well, here are the threats, and who's actually helps us in terms of dealing with these threats? well, that reality, I suspect, is going to look a little bit different. He may still try to see if he can leverage greater contributions from others. He's going to find that he can't leverage those without the U.S. playing the role. And again, if he appoints, certain kind of people that are, some of the names that are being suggested, you're going to see that I think the more traditional American role of being actively engaged is going to, I think, will continue to be the norm. Now, we'll find out. Maybe that'll be wrong. We'll find out.
Can I just ask our panelists to keep their answers brief so we can take a few questions from the audience after?
Will the U.S. invite other international actors to enter the Israeli-Palestinian arena? I doubt it, for the reasons Dennis outlined. I don't think the parties themselves are, certainly Israel is not interested in any other international party and will do its utmost to stop that. Israel is open to major Arab states today playing a role, and that could happen if Trump decides to play a role, and he could be part of that regional axis. And the idea being not that the Arabs will come out with a new peace initiative, or it is that they will open space for both parties to move ahead. Namely, they will give Israel measures of normalization that will open the Israeli government space for dealing more with the Palestinians and also legitimize certain Palestinian moves. That, yes, so Arabs play a role, but internationals, Russia or Europe, I don't think so. And look what happened when the Russians invited the parties to come to Moscow and for a peace conference. It hasn't happened until today. Both parties said yes, and it hasn't happened. Why? I do see the possibility of the US trying to find common ground with Russia on other Middle Eastern issues, especially on Syria. If I had to speculate, I would say that Trump would try and reach a deal with Russia about Syria, where he allows them to play, to continue to play their role, kind of legitimizes it, when Assad stays in place for, at least for the time being. Perhaps as against understandings that he will be more assertive vis-a-vis Iran. Will that work? It's anybody's guess.
Okay, the United States has 10 aircraft carriers. Russia has one and it doesn't work properly. Yeah. Okay, there is no alternative to the United States. If other powers come in, it's only because the United States has taken a step backwards. It's more powerful than the next 4 or 5 countries militarily put together. And even though it's got a global reach and therefore it has to spread its forces out, there's just no alternative. It's just no alternative. The Chinese are a regional power. They are not a global power. They need the US Navy to protect energy supplies from the Middle East to reach them in China. They would like to change that, but they can't do it right now. So there is no alternative. But that doesn't mean, and it has never meant, that the United States can force the parties themselves to reach an agreement that will sustain beyond the moment at which the Americans shake hands with both sides. So, I suspect that Ehud is right, that really Israel needs to be the only grown-up in the room and sort it out and do what it can do. But a question could be, could an American president change the balance of probabilities of that Israeli government being formed? In other words, would it be easier to form a particular type of Israeli government? We had negotiations between someone you know quite well and the Prime Minister, and so I'm led to believe that there wasn't such a wise gap between them, but they couldn't get their parties together. If an American president comes down and says, I'm going to back you on what you agree on, that might make it a lot easier to form a different kind of government, which might possibly, if we want to be optimistic, lead to a different kind of dynamic.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether the American president has a way really to affect the composition of the next Israeli parliament, and I think elections are coming sooner than is scheduled. I'm not sure about that. I'm sure about one thing which I would like to reiterate briefly. I think in many ways it's Israel moment. We have to take action. Now, I said something about the Palestinians. That's one direction. I'll give you another example. I think that the reluctance of an untrigger happy prime minister to play Syria the way he did was probably a grave mistake. We could have helped with others, Jordanians, for example, but others. We could have changed the balance of power in southern Syria, south of Damascus, 100 kilometers to our border, to the Jordanian border, by doing A, B, and C. Israel's choice was not to do that. What do we do if after East Aleppo, the Russian Air Force switches to southern Syria? They already bombed there again this week. What do we do if they crush the rebels there, not very difficult, and pave the way to the Iranian militias and Hezbollah to position themselves securely along the Golan Heights border? It's ours to play. And just remember history. Before the State of Israel was declared, before 48, the Arab Affairs Department of the Jewish Agency was involved in politics all over the region. Golda going to meet King Abdullah. They were all over the place. President of Syria, prime ministers of Egypt, they were active. They were playing the game. We had the experience, we Israelis, had the experience of the First Lebanon War, 1982. Sharon goes to Beirut, yes, expels the PLO, but fails to change Lebanon and have his own man installed as president. Since then, Israelis behave or conduct themselves as if our fingers were burned and no more again. My opinion, big mistake.
I have to apologize to our audience. I've just been notified that we're going to have to vacate the room a few minutes earlier than anticipated, so we won't have time to take questions. But I do ask us to thank our panel for a wonderful session, and surely we'll be hearing more from our experts after January 20th.